Hello and welcome back to the French Revolution, and we're going to be checking out today the social order in France, the second part of that. Before we begin, I actually want to say thank you to George for the creation of the sick cover image for the channel. Really excited and happy to have it up there. If anybody else wants to send in some images to be putting up as the cover image of the channel, I'd be more than happy to rotate that around. And also thank you to Pierre for the awesome intro clip into the videos that I'll be using from here on. Again, if anybody else wants to send some in, I'm happy to use them. So let's begin now by starting off with a little bit of general information about the three estates within French society that we touched on last time. Now, firstly, I need to say that there's actually it's not a normal divide like we would see in a feudal society, or you may have covered in previous topics where you have people at the top, like the king, who are the wealthiest, and then the social classes go from top to bottom, and it kind of follows the wealth. So the people at the top are the wealthiest, and the people at the bottom are the poorest. Within the breakup of the estates, the first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate being everyone else, there's actually a huge variety of wealth within those estates. And I'll give you some more information about that as we go on, but I just wanted to say that there is a huge variety in wealth, and we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. A really important fact within the understanding of the first and second estates is that their population combined, or their numbers combined, equaled only 1% of the French population. And that's a figure given by J.M. Thompson. So if we move on, we will see that the first estate, it actually numbered 0.6% of the population and owned 10% of the land. And those figures are given by a historian called McPhee. And if we then understand the fact that there's such a tiny proportion of the population, yet they have such a significant control over the land, that gives us a lot of insight into the influence within French society during this period. Now, again, like we mentioned, there is a huge variety in wealth. So a regular village priest could be earning roughly 750 French pounds per annum, whereas an archbishop could be earning 450,000 pounds per annum. And that information comes from Adcock, A-D-C-O-C-K. And one of the most important things that we need to understand is the concept of tithing. So if you've been to church before, or you've grown up within a church, you may have heard of this concept. But essentially, it's the giving of 10% of your income to the church. And the church within French society, the First Estate, they had the right to apply a tithe of 8 to 10%, it varied depending upon the region that you were in, 8 to 10% upon the income of those within the Third Estate, whilst at the same time they paid only 1% tax upon all of their own income. So we can see from this that those within the First Estate were highly privileged with receiving a huge amount of tax from the Third Estate, yet only having to pay 1% of their entire income. Let's move on now to the Second Estate. Going from McPhee's figures again, they were 0.4% of the French population and actually owned 30% of the land, so 3 times the amount of the First Estate. So it's quite significant how a tiny proportion of French society controlled a huge amount of the land within France. Now, this does have it does state to an extent the role of the nobility within French society. And sorry, I didn't actually say, I don't believe, the Second Estate were the nobility. And their role extended beyond just being landowners. So they dominated public office and positions within the government. They had significant tax exemptions, and they also had high posts within the church as well. So some people who were nobles were also a part of the clergy too. And the nobility were broken down into two main classes, or two main divisions within the Second Estate. They were the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the robe. in a really basic way of understanding this is the nobility of the sword were older families whose past family members, so family members in the past, had distinguished themselves through military service or battle, had been granted land or wealth as a result of that, and they'd managed to hold on to that wealth and were very influential as a result of that. Nobility of the robe were recent high civil servants who had bought their positions, and this occurs generally from the 17th century onwards. So there were actually members of the third estate, the bourgeoisie, who had been able to save up enough money to buy themselves nobility, to buy themselves entry into the second estate. And they were generally perceived to be of lesser status than the nobility of the sword. Let's move on now to the third estate, and as we can see, the third estate constituted a whopping 99% of the population, and again there is a huge disparity in wealth between those individuals and groups within the third estate. Like I've mentioned previously, the third estate comprised of people who were not a part of the first and the second. So that ranges from really, really wealthy businessmen and bankers and lawyers all the way down to poor serfs who were struggling to survive off the food that they were able to grow on the land that they were renting. So there's a huge disparity of wealth, and the bourgeoisie were really, really important. And I'm going to read a quote here describing what the bourgeoisie actually were from Adcock. The bourgeoisie were a wide range of people, from wealthy bankers, merchants, and some industrialists, to middling people of the professional classes, such as lawyers or owners of shops and businesses. Now, the bourgeoisie were generally wealthy, and they lived in towns and cities, and there were a range of occupations within the bourgeoisie, but again also within the third estate as a whole. Now, the bourgeoisie are really important within our study of the French Revolution. They are one of the most significant features of the French Revolution, and some historians argue that without the protests and the unrest that the bourgeoisie felt, the French Revolution may never have happened. Now, we're going to investigate this and actually find out whether or not you agree with that belief, but understand that the bourgeoisie are really, really important, so we're going to focus a little bit on them over the coming weeks. So by 1780, the bourgeoisie actually controlled the majority of France's commercial capital, and they had benefited hugely from the industrial expansion of the 18th century. However, the problem of being a bourgeoisie was that you were actually still subject to significant taxation, which members of the first and second estates weren't. So they were very wealthy, yet they were also very underprivileged in comparison to those within the first and second estates. And as Adcock states, and I quote, "The greatest aim of the bourgeoisie was to become noble." So what that essentially means is they were focusing so much on trying to not be a part of the third estate and to promote themselves into being nobility of the robe to purchase public office. Now, on the other end of the wealth scale within the third estate were peasants. And peasants, unfortunately, were seriously exploited within French society during this period. The majority of workers were peasant farmers, and they suffered hugely. The majority of peasants were uneducated and illiterate. They weren't able to read. And as we look into the formative stages of the actual revolution, we'll see that there are numerous examples where the inability of the peasants to read and write means that their disputes with the first and second estates and the disputes with the royal family are never actually communicated, and that's one of the significant reasons for the revolution. But anyway, they were exploited. They often were entered into unfair legal contracts because they couldn't actually read what they were signing. And so they might get told one thing, sign a contract, and then when they were unable to fulfill their obligations in that contract, be called up to the law courts where they would have signed off on that contract and so be held to it, but they didn't actually realize that's what they were signing in the first place. They also had to pay tithes, which was, like I mentioned, 8 to 10% of their income, and feudal dues, which basically means that whichever noble owned the land that they may have been working on, they would have to pay a certain percentage of their income on as a tax to that noble, on top of the tithe and on top of whatever additional contracts it had, and on top of whatever other jurisdictional requirements they had depending upon where they lived. So peasants were seriously exploited within French society, and we'll see that the economic depression that the peasants experienced, well, all of French society experienced, but particularly the peasants within the 1700s, is one of the leading factors of the revolution. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will continue up with looking at some of the formative ideas of the Enlightenment period that contributed to the revolution within our next session. Have a great day.